Hello, I am going to get through our lecture on voting, campaigns, and elections as quickly as I can. I'm running a little bit behind today. Got a spot on my nose removed, so anyway, we have this lecture today. I'm going to post your final quiz tomorrow morning, and you'll have through the end of the week to complete that. It'll be 10 questions, same as always on your quizzes. Our final lecture will be next Monday, and that is when your essay is due. If you have any questions, please let me know. And then the week of the 7th will be your final exam, and we'll be all done. All right, voting, campaigns, and elections. In 2016, something happened that's only happened 4 times in history happened for the second time in 20 years. A candidate who trailed in the national poll averages for the entire cycle and continued to trail in the popular vote won the presidency. Donald Trump was about 1 million or more popular votes behind Hillary Clinton, but was elected the president. You guys, just a side note, our current election is still evolving, and so I'm not going to delve into that too much. There are still a lot of things going on. So this is just, I'm going to talk about what happened last election right now. If you have other questions, we can chat about that another time. All right, so in 2016, Democrats really felt disenfranchised. Republicans were thrilled because honestly, they said that sometimes the system feels rigged against them, but in three of the last 7 elections, they'd won the presidency even though they had not won the popular vote. So Electoral College, we're going to talk about that today. You're going to be hearing a lot about this in the next month. It's a really interesting time to be talking about it. The Electoral College is going to meet in mid-December. I think they have to be done by December 14th to verify this election. So you'll be hearing a lot about this right now. It's kind of the appendix of American politics. It's like an organ that you don't really need anymore, and it's generally quiet and unobtrusive, and so you don't realize it's there. But when it gets inflamed, it's painful, and if it bursts, it threatens a system-wide failure. It's never really threatened the life of the republic, but it's really posed a crisis of legitimacy. Even my mom has been like, why do we have the Electoral College? So I've had to give her this lecture that I'm giving you guys today. When our founders were founding our country, there was this dilemma about how the executive should be chosen. The direct election of a president felt risky. The South would rebel because they didn't want slaves to vote. The North would always have the population advantage, but they didn't want to give Congress the ability to choose the executive like in the parliamentary system, because that would do away with the separation of power. So the Electoral College really seemed to be the compromise that worked well for them throughout the Constitution writing process. So the Electoral College means electors are going to be chosen at the state level, originally by state legislatures who've been elected by the people, and then eventually by the people themselves now. The number of electors awarded to each state would be based on the total number of representatives that state had in Congress. So this removed any objections from the South, since it had already decided slaves count as 3/5 of a person for determining how many representatives a state received. And the electors would cast a vote for the president based on their independent judgment about who would be a better presidential candidate. In Federalist 68, Hamilton wrote, a small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass would be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated tasks. But since our founding, our ideas about democracy have really changed. We don't see people as the threat to stability that the founders worried about, and we've introduced more popular control into the political process. We amended the amended Constitution to directly elect senators when they once were elected by state legislatures, and so now the entire Congress is directly elected by people. The Electoral College has evolved a little bit. In the early 1800s, states figured they could have more leverage if, rather than voting independently, all their electors would vote the same way. So when they began casting votes for the popular vote winner in their state, the founders who felt this violated the check provided by independent electors were really dismayed. So by the late 1800s, all states were choosing their electors by popular vote. Even with electors popularly chosen, the matter of how to distribute them remains, and that too is up to the state. Today, all but 2 states give all of their popular votes to the winner in that state. And I had a friend ask me this a couple weeks ago during the election. She said, why are Maine and Nebraska not solidly red or solidly blue? Well, they use a system based on congressional districts. And so our congressional district would vote Republican, but maybe the district beside us would vote Democrat. And so they give their electors based on that. So they give 1 elector per district. That's only in Maine and Nebraska. The rest of them, the entire state's delegates go to the Electoral College. Ironically, the winner-take-all distribution of electoral votes generally exaggerates the advantage of the winner, and that turns even a slight popular lead vote into a landslide in the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton said of Al Gore's loss in 2000, "I believe strongly that in a democracy we should respect the will of the people, and to me that means it's time to do away with the Electoral College," and called the Electoral College a disaster for democracy, which is ironic because that's how she lost the presidency. So why do we still have this archaic institution? What's at stake in keeping the Electoral College? We pride ourselves in our democratic government, but we have this love-hate relationship with the ideas of campaigns and voting. A lot of citizens believe that elections don't accomplish anything, that elected officials ignore the wishes of the people, and the government is rigged to benefit of the elite at the expense of the many. And we've talked about before, only about half of the eligible electorate even vote. But anytime we're looking for a leader to make a decision, to pick the captain of a football team, decide where to eat to dinner, our first instinct is to call for an election. There are other ways of deciding, picking the oldest, picking the wisest, the strongest, holding a lottery, asking for volunteers. But Americans really prefer an election, so we have a lot of elections. It's a nonviolent means for political change. Up until the last couple hundred years, it was really unimaginable that the average citizen would have any say in who would govern. Leaders were chosen by birth, by the church, by military, by church leader, or by current leaders, but not by the mass public. And political change was usually ushered in with violence and bloodshed, and that has changed. Americans really bought into the narrative that government with the consent of the governed is superior to government imposing on unwilling subjects, and that political change is best accomplished through the ballot box. Elections are really an amazing innovation. They provide for the peaceful transfer of power. Radical changes can take place without blood being shed. But how much power should citizens exercise over their government? Elite theorists believe that citizens should confine their role to choosing among competing elites. Pluralists think citizens should join groups that fight for interest in government on their behalf. And participatory Democrats call for more active and direct citizen involvement in politics. They all have consequences for how elections should be held. How often should elections be held? Should people choose through directly or through representatives? How accountable should people be to the people who elect them? Who should be allowed to vote? The founders were really of two minds. The Constitution reflects their fears that people couldn't reliably exercise wise and considerate judgment about politics. The founders built this layer of insulation between the national government and the will of the people. The president was elected not directly by the people, but by an electoral college, was expected to be this group of wiser than average men who could use prudent judgment. The electoral college is an intermediary body that elects the president. Only the House was popularly elected at the time, and the founders thought the government needed support of the masses, but couldn't be afforded to be led by what they saw as the public's short-sighted and easily misguided judgment. Elections really fulfill a variety of functions in modern democratic life. We select leaders, we give direction to policy, we develop citizenship, we inform the public, we contain conflict, we legitimize and stabilize our system. Are elections the best way to choose leaders? Can we trust the average citizen to make wise choices in the voting booth? There are thoughts on both sides of that. Running for office is hard, expensive, bruising. The simple truth is that elections only ensure that the leader chosen is the most popular person on the ballot. There's no guarantee that the best candidate will even run or be chosen. Only partially is an election about choosing leadership. It's also intended to keep leaders responsive to the concern of the governed. That can be voted out if a voter is displeased. Occasionally, elections produce marked shifts in public policy, like the New Deal. The New Deal's hands-on approach versus the previous administration's hands-off approach. Elections do achieve a remarkable consistency between the general preferences of citizens and the kinds of policies that the states enact. Elections really speed up the process by which changes in public preferences for a more activist or less activist system are translated into patterns of public policy. Participation in government is really valuable for citizens. Political efficacy is the citizens' feelings of effectiveness in political affairs. People who participate more feel more powerful and have a higher sense of political efficacy. And an important function of campaigns is really to educate the public. Despite the circus of campaigns, a campaign is a time of deliberation where alternative viewpoints are aired so openly so that citizens can judge truth and desirability of competing claims. We probably know and understand more about our government because of our electoral process than we would without free and competitive elections. We probably know more because of these crazy campaigns. Elections really limit our options for political influence, though. If they help us reduce our political conflicts, they also operate as a kind of safety valve for citizen discontent. There's always a way for an unhappy citizen to vent their energy. Elections can really replace parties, but they don't fundamentally alter the underlying character of the system. It's important for elections to make political outcomes acceptable to participants. By participating, we implicitly accept and thereby legitimize the results. The genius here is that participation tends to make political results acceptable even to those who lose. We're having a problem with that right now, but that is a song for another day. What if we don't vote? Does that matter? Would election outcomes be different if non-voters were to participate? Would higher levels of non-voting indicate that the democracy is not healthy? It's unclear whether it would benefit one party or the other if more people voted. Republicans tend to fear that encouraging more people to vote would result in more Democrats in the electorate, since they are disproportionately drawn from demographic groups who don't vote. There is some evidence that this is true. Low turnout might not affect those who wins an election, but elections do more than simply select leaders. Non-voting can influence the stability and legitimacy of the democratic government. The victor must govern the country, but sometimes as little as 25% of the electorate may have voted for the winner. Non-voting can also have a consequence for the non-voter. They may have different policy goals, but they're underrepresented by not voting. Even without being well-informed and following a campaign closely, Americans really still can cast an intelligent vote reflecting your best interests, but barely half of the adult population votes. Should ill-informed voters stay home? How easy should we make voting? One factor with a significant impact on whether people exercise their right to vote is the legal obstacle course they face. Election rules define who can vote and how easy it will be for those who are legally eligible to vote are able to do so. A lot of countries, the government takes responsibility for registering a citizen to vote, and sometimes it's required by law, so turnout is very high. We have regulations that kind of put a brake on voting participation by making registration a more burdensome activity, by making voting more difficult than it is in other places. Regulating the electorate is the process of setting rules that can define who can vote and how difficult or easy it will be to hand in a ballot. Even people who are deeply committed to democratic norms debate whether voting out ought to be made so easy that uninformed voters can go to the polls. Some think that voters should pass some sort of minimum threshold of involvement in the system. And so this is done kind of in the form of registration laws and limited voting opportunities. It helps weed out those who really don't know as much about the candidates or issues they're voting for. Those who reject this idea say everyone is obligated, who is obligated under the law to obey those laws should have access to making that law, and individuals may not know the nuances of public policy, but they do know their own interests best. The debate has become really how easy it should be to exercise one's right to vote instead of being fought over philosophical grounds about the nature of democracy. This has become a partisan power struggle. In 1993, Congress passed the Motor Voter Act, and this is legislation that allows you to register to vote at the same time that you apply for a driver's license or some other state benefit. That really has upped the voting registration. Constitutional amendments set fundamental voting protections based on race, gender, age, and then federal legislation like the Motor Voter Act. This makes it the law of the land. The Constitution gives states, though, the primary responsibility for determining how elections are held, how early and where to register, whether early voting is permitted, how long polls are open. All of these are made at the state level, and we've seen fluctuations throughout time. Even this year during COVID-19, we've had fluctuations on how states are doing that. Some states pass laws that require various forms of ID to vote. And almost half the states that have voting restrictions include various ID requirements. And they a lot of them cut back on opportunities for early voting. That has probably changed a little bit this year. A lot of people early voted this year. Who votes and who doesn't? Political observers, activists, politicians, political scientists worry about the extent of non-voting in the U.S. When people don't vote, they have no choice and no voice in choosing their leaders. The survey data tells us that older citizens vote at higher rates than younger ones. Gender makes a difference. Since 1984, women vote at a higher rate than men. And the likelihood of voting steadily goes up with income and education. Racial and ethnic minority groups participate at a lower level, and some groups have better representation than others. Voting varies dramatically, and it's important to different citizens. For some, it's a significant aspect of their identities as citizens. 87% of people think it's a very important obligation, though only about half of that actually vote. If we do vote, a number of considerations go into our decision, including our partisan ID, gender, race, ethnicity, stance on issues, opinion of the candidates. It's a very complex decision about how and whether to vote, right? Some of the low voter turnout is accounted for by changes in time over psychological orientations or attitudes toward politics. If people feel the government is corrupt, system is rigged, they can't make a difference, they won't vote. But the lower turnout could be because of the change in efforts in direct contact during election campaigns. Something called voter mobilization is the party's efforts to inform potential voters about issues and candidates' ability to persuade them to vote. Making phone calls, knocking on doors, supplying rides to the polls. This is something, it's GOTV, Get Out the Vote. Both parties invest heavily in this Get Out the Vote effort that has led to increased participation in presidential elections. I actually have participated in a lot of GOTV. In 2012, I went to Syracuse, New York, and knocked on doors for like 4 days just to get out the vote. It's really important. And you probably had, if you're 18, you may have gotten text messages and mail and phone calls. These are all GOTV, Get Out the Vote measures. Social connectedness, citizens' involvement in groups and their relationships to their communities and families, that is, there's kind of a decrease in that these days. We are leaving the communities where we grow up. A lot of people live alone, join fewer groups, and so we lose these ties to larger community, and we have less stake in participating. Is it a rational act for an individual to vote? Nobody's one vote can really change the course of an election unless there's an actual tie, and even that probability is small. But there are expressive benefits. It feels good to do what we think we're supposed to do, or to help the cause that we believe in, and we get some social rewards from our politically involved friends, like me, for voting. Deciding who to vote for is a lot of times shaped by party loyalty, group identity, as much as the candidates and their positions themselves. The single biggest factor accounting for how people decide to vote is party identification, and then social group characteristics can exaggerate these party loyalties. The impact of gender is not really clear. There's a gender gap on positions men and women take on issues, which leads women to support more Democrats most of the time, but married women are more conservative than single women. African Americans tend to vote Democratic. About 90% of African Americans vote Democratic from 88 to 2004. Ethnicity is less predictive than race. Different ethnic groups have become politically diverse as they assimilate into the system. Immigrant groups, though, are typically Democrats. Ideally, highly attentive citizens would pay careful attention to the different policy positions offered them, and then perhaps aided by informed policy analysis from the media, cast their ballots for the candidate who best represent their preferred policy solution. They're limited, though. People are busy and a lot of times rely on party labels to tell them what they need to know. People know where they stand on easy issues, like maybe like gay marriage, but other issues are a little more difficult. Some citizens tune out these more complicated issues or fail to vote on their own interests, but the media doesn't necessarily cover these issues in depth. They prefer to focus on like the horse race aspect of elections. People process a lot of policy relevant information in terms of their impressions on the candidate rather than as policy information. We can't necessarily articulate an opinion and preference on policy as much as we can about whether or not we like a person. The idealized model of policy voting is perspective voting. Perspective voting is basing your voting decision on a well-informed opinion and the consideration of the future consequences of a given vote. We base our decisions on what will happen in the future if we vote for a candidate. The other side of this is retrospective voting, basing a voting decision based on reactions to past performance, approving of the status quo or desire for a change. Do we like how Donald Trump has been as our president? Do we approve of that, or do we desire for a change? Reagan asked, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And politicians have really been asking that question ever since. Donald Trump said, keep America great. This is sort of easy decision making. You kind of have to say, how are things going as a guide to whether or not to support the current party in power. Voters base contests a lot of times on judgment about a candidate as an individual. Is this a beauty or personality contest? Not always. Each campaign works hard to define its own candidate in positive terms. A presidential campaign is long and expensive. Being president is hard, but getting the job is hard. Each party has to nominate a single viable candidate. Prior to 1974, they were mostly kind of beauty contests, but primary elections were kind of beauty contests because their results were not really binding. But since then, party nominees have been chosen in primaries, taking the power away from the party elite and giving it to the activist members of the party who care enough to turn out and vote in the party primaries. Several crucial steps between wishful thinking and running. You test the waters. You have this invisible primary. You have this attempt to raise money early. If that goes well, then you file with the FEC to set up a committee to receive funds so they can have an exploratory committee, formed to determine the viability of one's candidacy. Third, it takes a lot of money. So those with pre-primary funds are more likely to win. Fourth, the potential candidate must use the pre-primary season to position himself as a credible prospect with the media. And then fifth is the official announcement of candidacy. Then you have primaries and caucuses. A caucus is a local gathering of party members who choose convention delegates. Most states hold primaries, but there are still 15 states who hold caucuses. And then you have a presidential primary. This is an election by which voters choose a convention delegate committed to voting for a certain candidate. We talked a little bit about an open primary versus a closed primary. Last class, an open primary is a primary election in which an eligible voter need not be a registered party member. A closed primary is a primary election where only registered party members may vote. State primaries vary at the time in which they're held, while various states engage in what's called front-loading. This is the process of scheduling presidential primaries early in the primary season to gain maximum media attention. By tradition in state law, Iowa and New Hampshire are the first contests. South Carolina is usually the first in the South, so we get a lot of media attention for that as well. You are looking for the front runner, the leading candidate, and the expected winner. Early front runner status garners a candidate a lot more media coverage and really reinforces everyone's expectations that a candidate is a winner. But they can be punished if they fail to live up to the hype. Momentum, of course, is the widely held public perception that a candidate's gaining electoral strength. And then there's the convention. Since 1972, delegates attending the National Convention haven't had to decide on who the nominees would be, but two official actions take place at the convention. The parties hammer out and approve their platforms, and then the second is the vice presidential candidate is officially named. We saw these taking place this summer, virtually this year because of COVID-19. And then there's the general election campaign. There's a short break between the summer primary season and the fall campaign season. Most of this battle is now for a swing vote. There are a lot of swing voters, or the approximately 1/3 of the electorate, who are undecided at the start of a campaign. So you're really fighting to win those votes. The presidential election is not a national race. It's a race between the candidates in each of the 50 states and DC, and the reasons for the Electoral College's existence may seem outdated at times, but it really drives campaign strategy. The Constitution provides for each state to have as many electoral votes as it does senators. So thus, Alaska has 3 electoral votes, and California has 55 electoral votes. DC actually has 3 electoral votes as well. So there are 538 total votes in all, 435 members in the House, 100 members of the Senate. And the electors are generally activists of the party whose presidential candidate carried the state. They meet in December, where they vote in their state capitals. I think it's going to be December 14th this year. And the results are sent to the Senate, where ballots are counted, and the new session opens. The importance of the Electoral College is that all states but Maine and Nebraska operate on a winner-takes-all basis. And so the winner in California, even if he or she has less than a majority of the popular vote, wins all 55 electoral votes. The loser may have won 49% of the popular vote, but gets nothing in the Electoral College. It's so interesting. Obviously, this has only happened a few times in history. Most recently in 2000, where Bush received the Electoral College majority, and then in 2016, when Hillary Clinton received the popular vote and Trump won the Electoral College. Over the years, there have been a lot of bills introduced in Congress to reform or abolish the Electoral College. There are a lot of criticisms that it's undemocratic because it's possible for the popular winner not to get a majority. In a very close contest, the popular outcome could be dictated by a few faithless electors who vote their consciences rather than the will of the people in their state. That's actually recently the Supreme Court has said that can't happen anymore. The Electoral College distorts candidate campaign strategies, and a winner-take-all provision in all but 2 states put a premium on a few large competitive states which get a disproportionate share of the candidate's attention. Would we choose the Electoral College all over again if we started all over? I don't know. What do you think? It will probably never be changed, though. Okay, so now you are running for president. Who runs your campaign? Most campaigns are led by an amateur, like a nationally prestigious chairperson who is going to be doing your fundraising, but the real work's being done by the professional staff of the candidate hires. Trump relied a lot on his kids, especially on his son-in-law. Some jobs require not only the well-known ones of campaign manager and strategist, but more specialized components tailored to that particular campaign. You have somebody doing opposition research, which is an investigation of your opponent's background for the purpose of exploiting a weakness or undermining credibility. Candidates also need folks who are going to do their advance work, their advance teams to plan and prepare their travel agendas, arrange for crowds to greet candidates at airports, reserve accommodations for the press. Staff devoted to fundraising is important. They need a legal team, and they need consultants to provide technical support. Okay, so that's kind of your staff. You're going to also need to present your candidate. They need to have Obama's campaign really controlled a campaign narrative with an unprecedented use of technology, a massive and very well-organized volunteer component. And then you're going to have issues that matter to voters as they decide how to vote. There's two kinds of issues to consider when planning a strategy: balance issues and position issues. A balance issue is an issue on which most voters and candidates share the same position. Motherhood and apple pie issues, because nobody opposes these. Everybody wants a strong, prosperous economy, for America to be respected, a clean environment, opposed crime, drug abuse. Then you have a position issue where the parties differ in their perspectives and proposed solutions. These are issues where there are two sides, like abortion. There's pro-life and pro-choice. Most candidates have hard decisions to make on these. And a clear stand means they make some friends, but they also may gain some enemies. So candidates sometimes try to avoid being clearly identified with the losing side. When a candidate does take a stand on a difficult position issue, the other side often uses that as a wedge issue, which is a controversial issue that one party uses to split the voters in the other party. And then issue ownership is the tendency of one party to be seen as more competent in a specific area. Like Democrats tend to be seen as better on education. Republicans tend to be seen as better on crime-related problems. So the trick is to convince the voters the election is about the issue that party owns. Balance issues are safe, so candidates really stress them often and focus on position issues that their party owns. The real campaign is about which issues should be considered. You have to also obviously deal with the media. It's impossible to understand the modern political campaign without appreciating the pervasive role of the media. We have 24-hour news stations, right? It's up to the campaign to try to manage that incredible flow of information. And you have two kinds of information: the kind you pay for and have some control over, and the kind that you don't. You pay for these like campaign ads, and then you have other media that just kind of appears. A social media campaign, you don't necessarily have to pay to get your message in front of others. It can be viral and shared across the internet, but they also can be created by anybody. Negative advertising. What are you doing over there? Negative advertising. These are campaign advertising that emphasizes the negative characteristics of opponents rather than one's own strength. This really turns off voters. We see a lot of it, right? And then we have our debates. Since 1976, presidential debates have been one of the major focal points of the campaign. In 1960, the first televised debate was between JFK and Nixon. JFK was younger and more photogenic, and he came out ahead. But those who heard it on the radio thought Nixon did a better job because he wasn't, they couldn't see how pretty JFK was. Leading candidates find it less in their interest to participate in debates because they have more to lose and less to win. Winning a presidential campaign involves a lot of money. There used to be something called government matching funds, which is money that was given by federal government to qualified presidential candidates in the primary and general election campaigns. Came from a box that we checked on tax returns for $3, $6 on joint returns to fund a presidential campaign. Obama did not accept this, and since then nobody's really accepted it. Hard money. This is campaign funds that are donated directly to candidates that are limited by federal election laws. And then you have soft money, which is unregulated campaign contributions by individuals, groups, parties that promote some general election activities but don't directly support candidates. You have things like an issue advocacy ad that are paid for by soft money and are not regulated but maybe promote a certain issue but don't endorse a specific candidate. And then get out the vote. I talked about that a little while ago. GOTV drives efforts to mobilize voter turnout. This is done by knocking on doors, by TV ads. They started mistaking it GOTV for get on TV rather than get out the vote. And so now it's there has been a renewed effort to get potential like face-to-face contact. That probably changed in this because of COVID-19 though. Interpreting elections. So after the election is over and votes are and the votes are counted and we know who won, It seems the election season is over, but as we can tell now, it's not. Now we need to interpret, and probably the most important interpretation is the one articulated by the victor. The winning candidate claims an electoral mandate, the perception that an election victory signals broad support for the winner's proposed policies, and the losing party is going to try to argue that its loss was due to the the characteristics of its candidate or specific campaign mistakes. Do too many informed voters lead to too much conflict? We have three models of citizen activity in democracy we've talked about: the elite model, the pluralist model, and the participatory model. But an American citizen's role in elections really seem to borrow from all three of those in a way that could be called the fourth model. American citizens make a difference in American politics through the mechanism of elections. Most citizens have surprisingly low levels of interest in presidential campaigns. Instead of people relying on new information, people vote according to groups where they belong. Citizens play different roles, and together these roles combine to form an electoral system that has the attributes we prefer. But there's an obvious flaw. It's biased against the interests of those who are least likely to be the activist or pluralist citizens: the young, the poor, the educated, the minorities. If we are involved enough, do the elections we participate make any difference? They should represent the voice of the people charting the directions for government or policy. But do they matter in terms of who wins? Yes, I think they do. Parties stand on opposite sides of many issues, and given the chance, they will move the national policy in the direction they believe in. For example, electing Democrats are going to result in a more liberal policy. Electing Republicans are going to result in a more conservative policy. But citizens can and do change what the government does. We do that through the ballot. All right, that was really quick, guys. I'm sorry. I hope you guys are following what's going on in the Electoral College right now. Let me know if you have any questions. I will be back next Monday with our final lecture. Tomorrow, I will post your final quiz. And do not forget that your essay, which is 20% of your grade, is due on Monday. Let me know if you have any questions with that, and I'll see y'all soon.